It's time to talk about Cambridge Analytica and Vote Leave and breaking the law during the referendum. So I haven't actually done a video on this yet, but this is the news from the Evening Standard last night. Crime committed over Brexit vote. 3 QCs have put a 46-page legal dossier into the Electoral Commission about Vote Leave's behaviour. So this is a complex story. I've got my notes because I want to try and distill it into an easy to understand map of some very complex things that have happened. So essentially what we're looking at is a cluster of companies: SCL Elections, Cambridge Analytica and AggregateIQ. I'll tell you about those. And then campaigns both in the UK and the US. So we're talking about Leave.EU, Vote Leave, BeLeave, a few others. But then in the US, Ted Cruz's campaign and Donald Trump's campaign, and how this lot have been working together and why there has been suspected dodgy behaviour and also outright criminal behaviour on them. Let's start with the actual engine here, the companies. SCL Elections has been going for a while. It is a company that works on manipulating and influencing elections and has done that for our Ministry of Defence. It's a List X company and it has bragged about how it has influenced elections in other countries. It looks like it has spun out a new company called Cambridge Analytica that was financially backed by Robert Mercer, who has connections with Steve Bannon, etc. Cambridge Analytica is the central company in this, the one that borrowed from Cambridge University research to suck in all that information from Facebook, 50,000 profiles, to then go and use for targeted data. AggregateIQ, or AIQ, is linked with SCL Elections and Cambridge Analytica because, as reported by the whistleblower Chris Wiley, it had been referred to as our Canada office by Cambridge Analytica people, and there's now been evidence of how they're linked via basic code. So those three, SCL Elections, which is a long-standing psychops for the military company, and Cambridge Analytica and AggregateIQ, based in Canada, are the powerhouses of what we're going to go through now. And the campaigns involved are the two main campaigns in the UK, Leave.EU and Vote Leave. And then we'll go into the others. But it looks like overall this group of companies lent their skills or sent their skills first to Ted Cruz in the US, then to the referendum campaign, and then back over the pond to Donald Trump to help him win his campaign. Basic methodology being using harvested Facebook data in order to predict your character type and send targeted messages to you. So the history goes like this. We'll start with Leave.EU and Cambridge Analytica. It has been bragged by both Leave.EU on their page and also by Cambridge Analytica that Cambridge Analytica gave them a boost in their campaigns. Also, when Leave.EU launched, there was footage of Cambridge Analytica people being there at the time. However, they then later claimed that Leave.EU had not spent a penny on Cambridge Analytica, in which case, what were all these claims about? If it was work done for the campaign without charge because it was a gift, then that is a breach of rules because it's contributions in kind. So that's your first warning signal. Then Alexander Nix of Cambridge Analytica told our select committee, for digital culture, media and sport, that were doing an investigation into fake news and disinformation. He said, no company under our group of vehicles in Cambridge Analytica or SCL worked on the EU referendum. We now know that's absolutely false because we already have Vote Leave, who spent 2.7 million with AggregateIQ, and the DUP paid into AggregateIQ, and Veterans for Britain paid into AggregateIQ, and BeLeave paid into AggregateIQ. Alexander Nix has now been fired. But then also, when you had those whistleblowers come out from Cambridge Analytica, so Chris Wiley, that's the guy with the pink hair, and Alexander Kogan, who initially were setting up this project, they said that Cambridge Analytica had also harvested all of this data from Facebook. Facebook had been denying this, but now they acknowledge it. And when all of that came out as to how that system was working, you know, cleaning up data from not just people who signed on to an app, but also of all of their friends, this wiped off 79 billion from the stock price of Facebook. They know they've done wrong by not checking how these data are being used. Right, so that's the whole story so far, as it were, with Leave.EU and Cambridge Analytica, and why there are gaps here as to the methodology, as to what services were rendered, and why people were lying about it to investigations. Now we come on to the second part, which is about Vote Leave and the BeLeave campaign. So during the referendum debate, the main designated campaigns were allowed to spend 7 million each, and any secondary unrelated campaigns were allowed to spend 700k each. So at Scientists for EU, we registered our own campaign, for example, and then we had that 700k spending limit. And it was extremely clear at the time that you were not allowed to coordinate between campaigns on resource sharing or money, because then you're effectively the same network, the same campaigns. So even though that was the case, it was suggested in February 2016 by Steve Baker that everyone should back Vote Leave, because what Vote Leave were going to do was set up a whole network of different campaigns, each of which could receive 700k, so they could go far over their spending limit and spend as much as they needed to do. Jolyon Morm, QC, reported this widely. It got into the Times, and then Vote Leave said, no, misunderstanding. Later on, in May, Leave.EU tried to do exactly this with their spin-out campaign, Grassroots Out, and the Electoral Commission had to strike off, I think it was 11 different campaigns that were called Grassroots Out Left, Grassroots Out Steel, Grassroots Out Nurses, and, you know, this kind of stuff, because they were all linked to the same address. So if you gave them 700k each, well, they could be spending as many millions as they liked. So that was struck down. But there was one thing that seems was not caught, and that was a student working in the Vote Leave campaign as a volunteer by the name of Darren Grimes, a 23-year-old fashion student, set up his own campaign called BeLeave with very similar logo to Vote Leave, and then in the last few weeks of the referendum campaign, when Vote Leave hit its 7 million spending limit, then suddenly BeLeave got 625,000 to blast out social media advertising. Now, here's the thing. That money was spent via AggregateIQ, just like the Veterans for Britain was spent via AggregateIQ, and the DUP money we now found out was spent via AggregateIQ. So why would they all be using the same little operation off in Canada? It was dodgy. So this story broke after the referendum. It was August 2016 by Marie Leconte in BuzzFeed. And one of the interesting things is that this 625k was not a donation to Darren Grimes that he then spent himself. Darren Grimes clocked up a bill of 625k with AggregateIQ, which was then settled by donors. So what kind of company would say, yeah, that 23-year-old fashion student, he's good for 625k, just go and use the services and we're sure that donors will come and cover it later. So it was dodgy as hell. The Electoral Commission picked it up, but then tried to drop it I think it was November 2017, around then. Jolyon Morm, QC again, then jumped back in and said, Electoral Commission, you shouldn't be dropping this. This looks like a clear criminal case. We will take you through judicial review if you try to drop it. The Electoral Commission did try to drop it, and then on the last day of threatening, they said, okay, no, we'll pick it up again, and it will be ongoing. So that investigation is ongoing, which is why it is so important when this new whistleblower came out, Shamir Sani, who worked with Darren Grimes as his treasurer, said, yes, we got linked up with the Vote Leave campaign. We met all their people. We had our own campaign. We got given their money. They had access to our files and were looking at all of the content we were generating. So it was shared work there. And he himself was saying that basically it was cheating. And he himself was saying basically, this isn't British, this doesn't feel British to me. When you cheat in the Olympics, your medal gets taken away. I don't know what to make of all of this. Then the horrendous thing was that someone that he worked with within the Vote Leave campaign, this is Stephen Parkinson, now working for closely with Theresa May, then outed Shamir Sani and said that they had had an 18-month relationship, and this is why he was being a whistleblower, because he was bitter that that had ended. Now, this was particularly perilous to him because his own family didn't know that he was gay. His own mother didn't know he was gay. Stephen knew that, according to Mr. Sani, but also because he is of Pakistani origin and he has a family back in Pakistan, he's concerned how that would play out back in Pakistan, where being gay is illegal. So it was horrendous behaviour by Downing Street to have allowed that to come out. So, anyway, the long and short of the Vote Leave and BeLeave part of the story is that this was not adequately identified by the Electoral Commission until the funding came out afterwards. They picked it up and then they sort of dropped it off, were forced to pick it up again because they were being slack. It is now ongoing, and we now have a whistleblower from inside the system who says absolutely it was cheating in terms of sharing resources and sharing funding. And so that's why you then have this news here that 3 QCs have come along and said, we've looked at all of these details, and here's a 46-page report to the Electoral Commission saying this is clear criminal behaviour, it's a breach of code, and everyone knows that it's a breach of code because, look, we went through these hurdles at the time that this was unacceptable behaviour. Okay, so that's your summary of both. With the Cambridge Analytica stuff, it's all about misuse of Facebook data and whether they did actually help the Leave.EU campaign. And with the BeLeave and Vote Leave stuff, it looks like a fairly clear breach of using a front campaign in order to channel more money through in order to exceed your spending limits, and using these kids for that. This is before we even get into any other issues of whether Russian money has been involved with the campaigns overall and all the Russian bots on Twitter. Let's leave those to one side, and let's leave all the American investigations to one side. So, key questions now is, did this swing the election debate? When Tony Blair was asked about this on last night, he was like, well, you know, whatever, people make up their own minds for their own reasons. It is very hard at this stage to tell someone you only voted one way or another because they had resources to get to you first or whatever. So it's very hard to say that it swung the debate. But Mr. Sani himself says he thinks that it probably did. And Chris Wylie, giving testimony today in Parliament, says that he thinks that it probably did. I mean, why would you spend money on a campaign if you don't think that money is going to be effective? So it's something that's actually very hard to track and argue over what effect it actually had. But certainly, if it's a breach of rules, it's a breach of rules and should be pursued as such, because you also want to make sure that those kind of punishments are seen for next time in any election campaign in any country. There's also another issue, which is I saw on TV Isabel Oakeshott arguing with Carol Cadwallader, who has been absolutely the engine and force behind these investigations with The Guardian over the last sort of 1.5 years, and saying, oh, if you did such a thorough investigation on the Leave campaign, why don't you do the same on the Remain campaign? Well, it's because there was a hot trail at the end of the referendum for the Leave campaign with regard to the brags of Cambridge Analytica and Leave.EU, and then the spending as picked up by other journalists and the Electoral Commission, whereas the Electoral Commission already had a look at the Remain side, because I had to have a look at both sides, and found nothing there. So this is a real case of whataboutery. You know, everyone was at it, you know, why don't you investigate them as well? Yeah, because it got looked into initially and there was nothing there. This is like you getting pulled over by police because your car is swerving all over the road, you're playing loud music, your lights are out, and then when you pull over and you wind down the window, your car stinks of weed and beer, and you say, officer, why are you victimising me? Why don't you stop that car over there? Stop them. You know, it's ridiculous. If there's anything in the Remain campaign, and I can tell you from personal experience, they were paranoid as hell about any collaboration whatsoever. They wouldn't even retweet our stuff, you know, the Stronger In campaign, or list up the other grassroots campaigns, you know. If there was anything there, then any of these other journalists are welcome to go and have a look at it. So there we go, that's your summary. It's been a long one because it is a complex story and it is ongoing, but the summary is just that you've got your Facebook side of the story about how data is harvested and used, and whether that's fair game if you're sending different messages to different people and whether that can be tracked. And then if you're making donations in kind through actual work being done by some of these agencies, and then whether you've been lying about what work's being done, that's that package. And then the other package is the electoral spending rules during the referendum campaign, and how Vote Leave used BeLeave quite clearly in order, when they hit their limit, to try and funnel more money off in order deliberately to break rules when that was a known breach of rules. So those are the two key things at the moment. Done.